Okay, let's get started. Thank you all so much for being here today and joining us for the CSDE seminar series. My name is Rowan Arar. I'm an assistant professor in the Law Societies and Justice Department, and this year I am the seminar series' chair. It is my absolute pleasure to be able to welcome Ayaz Qureshi here today. And before we get started, I would like to read your bio to share with everyone your work and give them some context and background. So Ayaz Qureshi has carried out ethnographic field work on HIV/AIDS control in Pakistan. He received his PhD in social anthropology from SOAS, and I believe there was another PhD in international development too. Is that right? No? Oh, I think I saw that online.
That has yet to come.
Oh, okay, has yet to come. So he's been part of a number of research projects in the area of infectious diseases, reproductive and sexual health, and status of women in Pakistan. His research interests include sexual and reproductive health, NGOs, bureaucracy, healthcare systems, and neoliberalization and labor relations. He has published articles in the Journal of Royal Anthropological Institute, Development and Change, Anthropology and Medicine, and Global Public Health. He has a monograph that came out recently called AIDS in Pakistan, Bureaucracy, Public Good, and NGOs. And it is the first full-length study of HIV work in relation to government and NGOs. And the book encourages readers to reconsider the orthodoxy of policies regarding public-private partnerships by critiquing the resulting changes in the bureaucracy, civil society, and public goods. And so without further ado, I would like to invite you to come up here and share your work. We're very much looking forward to hearing your talk.
Thank you very much, Dr. Rowan, for that very nice introduction, very kind of you. And thank you to the Center and the Department of Sociology for giving me this opportunity to speak to you all here today. So in next 45 minutes, I will speak from the points that I have written down on this piece of paper. I might also read some of the paragraphs, so bear with me if it becomes too dense at times, but hopefully we will have time for questions and discussion. You can hear me all right at the back there? Yeah, good. And I assume that people on Zoom can also hear. If not, you raise your hand or indicate in some way that you can't hear us here. Okay, so climate change and displacement, health in Pakistan. I should share my slides to begin with. I can go on to, there we are. So that's the topic for today's talk: climate change, displacement, and health in Pakistan. And I start with a report by ICIMOD, an International Center for Integrated Mountain Development in Nepal. This is a research organization. So their report, a recent report, which came out in June or July 2023, talked about melting of Hindu Kush and Himalaya glaciers at a very high rate. And this report, these findings were picked up by a number of media outlets, raising alarm for its consequences. Hindu Kush and Himalaya glacier, as many of you would be familiar with the geography, stretched 3,500 kilometers across Afghanistan, Bangladesh, Bhutan, China, India, Myanmar, Nepal, and Pakistan. The report, which was titled as Water, Ice, Society, and Ecosystems in the Hindu Kush Himalaya, an Outlook, was published in 2023, as I said, in June or July this year. It talks about unprecedented rates of melting. HKH glaciers could lose up to 75% of their volume by the end of the century. According to one research, Mount Everest glacier has lost 2,000 years of ice in just 30 years. Since 2010, Himalaya glacier have disappeared 65% faster than the previous decade. Scientists claim that these changes to glaciers, snow, and permafrost of HKH region are not only unprecedented, but also largely irreversible, and they are driven by global warming. The report warns of the dangers of floods and water shortages for nearly 2 billion people who live in downstream of rivers that originate from these mountains, 12 rivers more or less. 2 billion people live in those plains, as you can see there in these countries. And we have seen some of this, some of the impact in recent years: flash floods and avalanches across the sub-Himalaya region, and floods and droughts further south. Water flows in rivers, including Ganges, Indus, and Mekong, are likely to peak around mid-century. This will be in the form of floods rather than steady increase in flow, and will have adverse consequences for more than 1.65 billion people who depend on these 12 rivers. Then there is significant risk of glacial lake outburst. So there are 200 or so glacial lakes across Himalaya, which are deemed to be dangerous. This is compounded by low levels of adaptability and preparedness. And again, we have seen very visible and dramatic impact, such as sinking of a whole Himalayan town of Joshimath in India earlier this year. And the disastrous floods in Pakistan in August 2022, and before that in 2010 monsoon season. These events are more frequent, irregular, unpredictable, and erratic. And there is no denying that they are triggered by climate change. According to Global Climate Risk Index reports, Pakistan experienced 152 environmental crisis events from 1999 to 2018, resulting in damage to nearly 200,000 villages, destruction of over 10 million acres of crops, and significant losses to GDP. Within a period of around 18 years, we're talking about here, 152 environmental crisis events in 18 years. And a lot of loss to economy, livelihood, and lives, and settlements, displacement. So like many of the world's most vulnerable and at-risk communities, Pakistan faces multiple consecutive disasters, leaving no time to recover before the next one comes. Pakistan is deemed to be the third most flood-affected country in the world after Bangladesh, India, and it has the most glaciers outside Arctic Circle. So I'll talk now with reference to the disastrous events of recurrent flooding in Pakistan. I'm trying to now narrow the focus on Pakistan after giving you a larger picture of the environmental changes that have been taking place because of the climate change. So Pakistan floods, 5 major flood events have been recorded, have occurred in last decade and a bit. So from 2010 to 2023, 5 major floods. In 2010, we had a major flood. Some of you would perhaps remember, it was big in the news. 2010 floods inundated over 70,000 square kilometers and affected 900,000 households. 20 million people were also affected. 2,000 people died. In 2011, again, another flood inundated 21,000 square kilometers, displaced around 6 million people, 360 deaths, 5.3 million affected, 1.2 million dwellings destroyed or damaged, and 1.7 million acres of agricultural land destroyed. And then again, next year, 10, 11, and 12. So 12 floods inundated over 1,300 square kilometers and resulted in the death of 100 individuals. So these floods in 3 consecutive years damaged hundreds of kilometers of railways and road networks, forest and agricultural land, and caused a large amount of human suffering. Then there were the epic floods of 2022, and now again in 2023. So within a period of 13 years, these 5 episodes of major floods. 22 floods submerged 1/3 of the country, and it's not a small country by any means. 1/3 of the country was submerged during 2022 floods, affecting 33 million people, half of whom were children. More than 1,700 people were killed and around 13,000 were injured. And 161,000 people were forced to live in relief camps. These are not just numbers, these are people, 161 individuals, people who were forced to live in relief camps in the aftermath of the floods. Out of 170 districts, at least 115 were affected by these floods. 1/3 of the country was submerged, as I said. 81 districts. 81 districts were officially designated as calamity hit districts, mostly in the southern part of Pakistan. One study reported that around 90,000 people in Sindh and 116,000 in Balochistan were permanently displaced. So large numbers. The economic loss from these floods, 2022 floods, amounted to somewhere between 30 to 40 billion US dollars. These floods pushed around 9 million people below poverty line and reversed health gains for millions more. And if you look at the losses in terms of agricultural productivity, and one piece of data that I have here as an indicator of what was happening is that in the province of Sindh alone, which is one of the 4 provinces, production losses for cotton were 88%. And this is a society, agricultural societies, which depend on agricultural production. And if your major cash crop is 88% less than it should have been without those floods, it has important implications for the lives and livelihoods of people. There were losses of 80% in the crops of rice and 61% in sugar. One study suggests that 2 million acres of agricultural land was damaged and 750,000 livestock animals were killed. When it comes to health facilities, more than 2,000 health facilities were destroyed and health services were disrupted, leaving more than 8 million people in flood-affected areas without urgent health care. So people were still recovering from this devastating 2022 flood when we had another flood in 2023, this time mainly in Satluj River. That shows you the physical features and geography of the area. So 2023, you can see Satluj River there. So this time, the flooding happened in the Satluj River, 2023. It's one of the eastern tributaries of Indus River, you see on the map there. In August 2023, the river Satluj expanded 4 kilometers wide at some places, resulting in evacuation of more than 100,000 people from nearby towns and villages. This extreme high-level flood was caused by torrential rains. Many families lost their homes, education, livelihoods, and in some cases, loved ones. Again, children were the hardest hit by this flooding in 2023, but we still don't know the exact extent of the damage that was done because of the most recent flooding. Now, I want to draw your attention to an important difference between these 5 episodes of floods in these 13 years, as I have been talking about. 2022 and 2023 flooding was different from the earlier pattern that we have of flooding in Pakistan. So the 2023 flooding was unusual in River Sutlej, which normally contributes least amount of water in the Indus River. So normally you would have floods in, you can see my cursor. So you will have torrential rains here, and you will have floods along the Indus River. But this river, Sutlej, does not very often flood, but this time it was very unexpected flooding in Sutlej River in the east. 2022 floods were also different because of the heavy rain that took place not only up there, but in these mountains, the western mountains of Balochistan. In Koh Suleiman Range, as it is known, in the west, and hill torrents, which were then joining Indus River, so flowing further down south and east from these mountain ranges, which is not a pattern of flooding that we had for many, many years, decades. We had some hill torrents overflowing, but not the massive scale that we have seen them in 2022. So in that sense, 2022 and 2023 flooding was slightly different in terms of where the water was coming from and which areas it was affected. And that obviously has implications for how prepared the communities were for that kind of flooding. So the 2022 floods were caused by exceptional monsoon in Pakistan, as the country received more than 60% of usual rainfall. Some estimates suggest that 87% more rainfall happened that year than the annual average, so 87% more than annual average. So in the province of Sindh, which is the southernmost part here, including the delta of the Indus River, there was 762% more rainfall than average for August. And if I can, I can show you that graph there. So just look at how much rainfall we got by comparison to average or normal. So this is for the province of Sindh, this graph, as you can see here. So in some places, the red line shows rainfall in August 2022. Blue line shows what what those communities were used to. So the extent of difference in rainfall is obvious from those graphs. Likewise, for the country as a whole, you can see there starting in July and then continuing into August, 2022 was exceptional when it came to rainfall in that monsoon season. The World Weather Attribution Group reported 75% increase in heavy rainfall in Indus River Basin in 2 months of monsoon in 2022. This extreme precipitation in August was caused by 2 atmospheric rivers that passed over southern Pakistan in those 2 months. These unusual events and unpredictably changing weather patterns have been explained as resulting from climate change. So I can't go into the science of climate change here, but there are a few things that we should keep in mind. First is that Pakistan contributes less than 1% of the global greenhouse emissions. It has a population of more than 230 million. mostly young people. And Pakistan is at the same time ranked among 10 most vulnerable countries to climate change. It's ranked as 9 in 162 countries. And finally, as it goes, when communities are prepared, extreme weather events do not become big disasters. It's a kind of truism, we all know that. If you're more prepared, you can reduce the extent of damage that can be caused by these weather events. But Pakistan is not prepared to manage these events when they result in, and that is to manage these events which result in a lot of death, displacement, disease, and other forms of human suffering. Now, how are we not prepared for these? In what ways are we not prepared for these kinds of events? One of the ways in which we are not prepared, many scholars in Pakistan argue, is the continuation and reinforcement of Pakistan's colonial era road and canal network, which they argue is incompatible with natural topography of the region and its water channels. These networks of roads, railways, and canals and barrages were built for colonial extraction. They interfere with the natural flow of hill torrents and flood waters. So these scholars who argue along those lines, and this is not just colonial era infrastructures, but they have been reinforced, and have been built upon, or they have been continued in many instances. These scholars give the example of water stagnation in 2022 to show their point. And I'll try to maybe explain this point of view. That slide shows the flooding, the effect of flooding from earlier floods. 2010 was a big flood too, but as you can see, that flood is on the eastern bank of the Indus River, whereas this one, 2022, as you can see there, has affected mostly the hilly areas and the hill torrents that were coming east and south from Solomon Ranges. So, okay, so 2022 floods, these scholars argue that the plains of Sindh here, around this area, have a mild slope which drains towards Indus Delta in the south and the river in the east. If I go back to the earlier map, that will help you visualize it better, I guess. So the hills and then a gentle slope towards south and east, where the water is usually drained from the mountains. The flood waters naturally drain out over these slopes as sheet flows. The soil of these plains have very high clay content, which absorbs very little water. The water table in most parts of Sindh under these plains is also very high. Therefore, water spreads over the plains after flooding events and can only drain out through sheet flows over the vast plains towards the river and the delta. The colonial infrastructure, as against that natural water system, the colonial infrastructure development has created linear obstacles across these vast plains of Indus. Roads and railway lines are built on embankments which cut across the plains for hundreds of kilometers. All irrigation canals and watercourses are also built on embankments. So they are raised from the ground. You have reinforced embankments for canals, for roads, which means that you are cutting across the natural flow of the hill torrents when the time comes. So if these obstacles, these scholars argue, were not there, the natural sheet flow would have drained the flood waters in a matter of days. The man-made embankments trap rainwaters by cutting off the natural sheet flow, as you can see in this satellite picture of one of the affected villages. So what we see here is that the canal is running with its embankments at the right angle of the course of the hill torrent here. Now, in some areas, embankments were breached naturally because of the force of the flow of water, accidentally, or they were breached deliberately also in some places, and water was released. But then that also resulted in a lot of tension within a community across that line. So same village, half of the village on the upside, half of the village on the downside. So you have a flood event, the water stagnates on the upside. The upside people want to to breach these canals or roads or embankments to let the water flow, but the downside people would be affected in that case. So there were social kind of tensions within communities. Therefore, many areas remained inundated for a long period of time. I could go into showing you this Google map. I'll leave it there, I think, for the paucity of time. But this kind of conveys the point of these scholars who argue against these colonial infrastructures. And this picture shows you how canals are built. So concrete embankments raised above the level of the ground and in the way of the natural flow of water, resulting in stagnation on the upside and tensions between communities on the upside and the downside. Now, what emerges from here then, from these infrastructures, is a situation where you have stagnant water, water that inundates a large area of agricultural land. So stagnant water, among other problems like destruction of houses, infrastructure and crops, and displacement of people and livestock, also affects the drinking water supplies of the flood affected areas. For example, here are some more numbers. One study suggested that 5.4 million people relied solely on contaminated water from ponds and wells after 2022 floods. According to another study, 6 million people were deprived of clean water and sanitation. 25 million Pakistanis already lack access to sanitation facilities. It's already bad situation, which is worsened by the situation of stagnant water because of floods. Open defecation, which increases during floods, and the consumption of poorly prepared food and water increases risk of cholera. A study in Karachi reported that 91% of water sample which was collected for the study was unfit for consumption, and 33% was contaminated with fecal matter. So these are big numbers. According to UNICEF, 6 months after the flood, as many as 10 million people had no alternative but to drink and use potentially disease-ridden water. So there's a vicious cycle here between poor sanitation, unsafe water, malnutrition, and infection. Diseases like diarrhea, which are associated with unsafe water and poor sanitation, prevent children from getting the vital nutrients that they need. And when children become malnourished because of the lack of those nutrients, their weakened immune system makes them even more susceptible to waterborne diseases, thus perpetuating this vicious cycle of malnutrition and infection in the geographical conditions of stagnant water. So unsafe water and poor sanitation, some of which is a direct result of climate change induced weather events, as I have been arguing so far, are the key underlying causes of malnutrition, unsafe water and poor sanitation. According to Pakistan Nutrition Survey of 2018, nearly 2 out of every 5 children in Pakistan, or 40%, suffer from stunted growth, which is a medical condition. 29% are underweight. 18% children under the age of 5 years suffer from acute malnutrition or wasting. That is to say that 1 out of every 5 children is wasted. 82% children under the age of 2 years are deprived of minimum number of meals a day. 82% children. And as I said, it's a population of 330, half of the population is young, or most of the population is young. And children obviously comprise a large number, under 2 or under 5. Malnutrition can kill, we know that. Wasting in children can put them at risk of death due to protein deficiency and infections. It also has an adverse impact on health and education outcomes. It may result in lower physical and mental productivity over a lifetime, ultimately affecting the economic growth and development of a country. Therefore, it does sometimes make it to the highest political forums as a matter of concern and worthy of discussion. For example, in his very first speech, in his inaugural speech in 2018, the former Prime Minister Imran Khan held up brain images of a healthy and a stunted 2-year-old to demonstrate the stark difference between their brain development. Stunting is not only a matter of impaired growth, he said, it also limits children's intellectual capacities and thwarts the nation's development. Now, despite this realization at the highest forums, at the highest political level, of the urgency and importance of addressing malnutrition, the policy interventions have focused on mainly nutrition education, reiterating the long-standing framing of the problem as being one of maternal ignorance and incompetence. The critical matter of social justice, which should draw our attention towards the wider structural conditions that enable or prevent people from exercising their human right to health, often goes unaddressed. And I would argue that some of the structural conditions have to be traced to climate change and displacement, as I have been talking about, through the example of stagnant water leading into poor sanitation and unsafe drinking water, to lower nutritional levels, to opportunistic infectious diseases, and that cycle continues. In so almost 40% of Pakistan's population already faces food insecurity. Average household spends half of their money, half of their monthly income, more than 50% actually, on food in normal circumstances. If there are any normal circumstances anymore, maybe not, given the frequency of floods that we have been talking about. 5 major events, millions displaced. That is the new normal in the world we live in. They are vulnerable to shocks such as price hikes, climate change, displacement, crop failure, and epidemics. In 2022 floods alone, around 1.6 million children were reported to suffer from acute malnutrition. This is not just saying that, okay, that person looks malnourished, or they don't have enough to eat. These are medical, public health, epidemiological categories based on certain concrete measures. And these are people in millions. In terms of other health impacts, so moving on from malnutrition to other health impacts, immediate health impacts of floods usually take the form of injuries, infections, and disruption of health services. We do not have much data on injuries, but disease outbreaks after 2022 floods included fever, dengue, hepatitis, gastrointestinal illnesses, diarrheal diseases, and measles in different parts of the country. There were also reports of increase in skin diseases, respiratory illnesses, malaria, snake bite, dog bite, and tuberculosis. Take the example of malaria. In terms of the numbers, in 2022, 3.6 million suspected cases were reported by comparison to 2.4 million in previous year. So malaria already endemic, you're reporting 2.4 million suspected cases every year, and it suddenly spikes in the year of the flood to 3.6 million. According to WHO, Pakistan saw a 4-fold increase in the number of malaria cases after the floods. And between July and October 2022, only in those months, about 540,000 malaria cases were reported. That's in a period of a few months. WHO concluded on the basis of these trends that floods have effectively driven the worst malaria outbreak in Pakistan since 1973 and resulted in a great setback to extensive malaria control efforts undertaken before the floods. Again, there's a connection with stagnant water. Poor sanitation and overcrowding has a lot to do with these outbreaks of malaria. Also keep in mind that women and children are more exposed to health hazards resulting from floods. A study on cholera found that women comprised 54% and children comprised 49% of the 2,000 cases that were reported in that study. Scabies, which is a contagious skin disease, was highly prevalent among children residing in flood-affected areas due to contact with stagnant water. Consuming contaminated water has resulted in multiple cases of diarrhea, vomiting, and fever. And as we know, children spend more time playing in flood water than adults do, and most of these children are already malnourished, whereas the already weak health system is further weakened during the floods. Therefore, there's a perfect combination for the spread of infectious diseases. Weak body, weak health systems, further weakened because of these weather events. And that is a perfect condition for the spread of infectious diseases. Waterborne diseases may claim more lives than floods themselves. Outbreaks of many of these diseases that I have just mentioned, localized outbreaks or outbreaks spread over a large area. And then there is overuse of antibiotics in the time of infection, cholera, for example, and that can lead to drug-resistant strains when you're overusing antibiotics. So it unleashes kind of a chain event. One bad thing begets another bad thing, and in that way it becomes a kind of vicious cycle. Floods also put immunization programs on hold, and many of you are familiar with the efforts to eradicate polio, which is now concentrated in a few countries, including Pakistan and neighboring countries. So polio vaccination is halted because of floods. Routine vaccination is halted because of floods. There are those negative impacts on health as well. Pakistan has a failing healthcare system. There is no doubt about that. Hospitals are not prepared to deal with such emergencies. The health crisis resulting from these floods also came as the country and its healthcare system were still recovering from the impact of COVID-19. Then there was this problem, this kind of continuing problem of doctors and health workers striking, taking industrial action, or their contestation or privatization of public sector hospitals. So the health system is weak from within, that the labor force within the healthcare system, which includes the doctors and nurses and healthcare workers, they have been striking, shutting down hospitals, not attending to their patients because they're contesting the privatization of the healthcare system in Pakistan, want to keep these big hospitals in the public sector, want to keep health as a public good. They're trying to defend that, which means there are disruptions in the healthcare system. There are problems of governance. There's a problem of keeping people in the jobs. Those problems, and then add to that pandemic, which was COVID pandemic, and then add to that effects of floods as well. With the disruption of essential services, those affected by floods forego care for routine chronic health conditions, maternity care, and life-saving vaccination. So here you can take example of HIV positive people, for instance. So it's not just that the floods create infectious disease at the outbreaks, but it also disrupts not only the healthcare facilities and systems or inpatients or outpatients, but also those who were receiving treatment for their chronic conditions like HIV, who cannot access the healthcare system in times of those emergencies. Physical illness often is compounded by psychological distress and health issues. And then moving on to sexual and reproductive health, I'll come back to mental health in a minute, but just a bit of data, some figures for sexual and reproductive health. Out of 33 million affected during these floods of 2022, 8.2 million were women of reproductive age who were forced to be displaced and seek refuge in temporary shelters and relief camps. 8.2 million women of reproductive age. And we know that many of the relief camps are unsafe for women. One study after 2010 floods found 66% of relief camps to be unsafe for young women. Many women experienced sexual assault and developed severe trauma and psychiatric problems. According to one study, 20% of women are likely to develop PTSD following sexual assault. One common condition among assault survivors was depression, otherwise sexual disorder, distressing dreams, and recollection of events, eating disorders, purging behavior. So in 2022, more than 650 pregnant women did not have access to obstetric care or birthing facilities because of floods, 650,000. Out of these 650,000 pregnant women in flood-affected areas, 73,000 were expected to give birth within a month of the floods. There was a rise in unwanted pregnancies due to loss of access to contraception, menstrual hygiene issues, mental health, domestic violence, and undernutrition. These issues are largely unreported, are poorly monitored, and the responses to these issues are most of the times reactive, sporadic, and uncoordinated. How are we doing for time? Okay, coming to that. Mental health. Natural disasters invoke strong sense of grief, panic, loss, fear, and sadness among victims. Death of loved ones, overall insecurity, including food insecurity, and then you are forced to live in relief camps which are insecure, and not being able to bury your dead, for example. So all kinds of psychological problems emerge. In 2020, global systematic review of 163 studies relating climate change and mental health found that 20% of flood victims were diagnosed with depression. So this is a survey of global level of flood victims and other people who are affected by climate change related events. So 20% of flood victims were diagnosed with depression, 28% with anxiety, 36% with PTSD. Similarly, across a cross-sectional study after 2010 floods in Pakistan reported a significant prevalence of depression, 54%, severe PTSD, 60% among flood victims in Sindh province. There are more statistics, but the point here is, I won't go through all of that. The point here is that there are high levels of clinically diagnosed mental health conditions in the aftermath of these events. One of the dangerous consequences of untreated mental health trauma is substance abuse, usually among young people. So there's a lot of stigma, which means that most of these problems remain unreported, and where they're reported, there's a kind of pushback from even the healthcare system because of the social stigma, which results into, in some cases, substance abuse. Children can be vulnerable to physical, verbal, sexual abuse after floods due to loss of protection, homelessness, losing access to education, and trauma of death of the loved ones. Longer-term effects, such as PTSD, may also appear in later life. Then there is the issue of domestic abuse, as we have seen in COVID pandemic. So in crisis, you have increased incidence of domestic abuse, anxiety for another calamity, stigma, and lack of social, medical, professional support, all of which adds to mental health problems. Now, according to the Ministry of Planning, Development, and Special Initiatives, 1 in 5 people in flood-affected areas will need mental health care. So there is some recognition at the state level that 1 in 5 people affected by flood will need mental health intervention, but mental health at the same time is absent from Pakistan government's 4R framework: resilience, recovery, rehabilitation, and reconstruction. This absence of mental health and psychological support services is similar to other natural disasters such as 2005 earthquake or even COVID-19. In terms of the available mental health care, global burden of disease data suggests that 15% of Pakistan's population, that is 25 million, suffer from mental health conditions. Yet there are only about 500 psychiatrists serving a population of 230. The majority of the worst affected districts in 2022 floods did not have a single psychiatrist. So there is already a lack of professional mental health care, which in the times of floods or other crises is compounded by lack of community support structure or community resilience, as everyone is experiencing hard times. And it takes time to build it again in relief camps or displacement. And even that might not come through. Instead, what you get are relief camps that are not safe for young women and children. Disability, we don't talk much about that. There's hardly any data on disability, but again, one can imagine how disability can be a very important factor in how you cope with or how you experience these crises. So I'll finally come to people-centered approach. And the point here is that vulnerability has vulnerabilities within it. So there's vulnerability within vulnerability also. The impact of extreme events such as floods in socially and especially uneven is socially and especially uneven because of the difference in socioeconomic status and between rural and urban areas. So as I gave the example earlier of breaching that canal or embankment, so if people downside are more powerful, they will not let you do that. So in that way, same event affects same community in different ways, depending on who is more powerful or who is more unequal. So politically based compensations for flood victims also, refugees inclusion, for example. So it is important to recognize that people have their own strategies to deal with these events. People save money to survive floods and other calamities. One study suggested that 36% of people said that they save money for unseen calamities, including floods, but they also need better and more information and timely forecasting to prepare better for these events. People seasonally migrate from low-lying areas or voluntarily evacuate, but they also need better and early warning systems, and government should provide that rather than coming to evacuate them at the 11th hour and dumping them in camps against their will. The standard approach has been to bundle up people and move them to safe places, refugee camps where you're not safe, or relief camps where you're not safe. But there are other approaches and local solutions that need to be taken into account. One should also mention that at a time of crisis like these, there are many unscrupulous actors who become active in the name of humanitarianism, including religious extremists who may take advantage of the situation. And they might cause further harm, injury, trauma, loss, and dispossession. People on the ground know more than policymakers give them or think about them. One study in 2010 floods reported that affected communities were fully aware of the causes of floods in their areas and their consequences. So inputs for disaster management should involve not just engineers and economists, but also other social scientists, anthropologists, ecologists, and importantly, local communities with their vast amount of relevant local knowledge. Disaster management is not just a technical problem, but also an institutional and regulatory problem. Therefore, it is a political problem. So in the way of conclusion, I know I'm running over time and I apologize for that. I'll take maybe 2 or 3 more minutes to just conclude and get the main message across. So flood water doesn't kill by drowning only. It also has long-term effects which take a huge toll on people's physical and psychological health. The 2022 floods have brought on double burden of communicable and non-communicable diseases, which further aggravates inequality and disparities in access to health. These floods resulted in massive setback to Pakistan's fight against malaria and polio, and a warning for the world of how climate change will impact disease response efforts. They compounded the problems already faced due to COVID-19, political turmoil, high inflation, etc. Pakistan has typically relied on short-term humanitarian external funding managed by UN for responding to acute health shocks and post-flood rehabilitation. So for example, between 1996 and 2016, Pakistan lost an estimated $80 billion due to climate change-related disaster events. At COP27, Pakistan led the advocacy of establishment of a loss and damage fund for vulnerable countries. There's also a discourse of climate justice and reparations, which is often combined with resentment towards technical fixes, modern infrastructure, and hegemony of development discourse and practice at the expense of undermining local and indigenous knowledge and practice. The government's response to these calamities in the local areas is led mostly by military, as with the national crisis of other sorts as well, including COVID. Local governments at the district level remain most neglected in terms of preparedness for these disastrous events. This leads to local political administrative institutions, civil institutions, because military comes and takes over. And then there is double weakening of the health system. National calamities destroy health facilities, weaken the health system. In response, what you have is military, which is not a healthcare institution as such. So they come and take over, further weaken whatever is left of the healthcare system. Okay, so I don't have any solutions, obviously, none of us do in our individual capacities, no big ideas here, but we should, I would continue with, I think, what is often said, we should understand and recognize these catastrophic events as resulting from climate change, and we should address climate change at all levels and everywhere. Health systems strengthening, more budget, more money, more resources. Health should be prioritized. Disaster preparedness training for health workers, given the frequency of disasters, which have become a kind of a new normal. And attention should also be paid to gender-sensitive care, mental health care, and disabilities, which are often neglected. People-centered and community-centered approaches, better communication and forecasting, building on local knowledge rather than privileging technical fixes. And finally, crises like these floods are not just events, they unleash and complicate processes of dispossession and deprivation and lifelong disabilities and traumas, and they push communities into poverty and aggravate inequalities within them. So they should be responded as such, rather than focusing merely on providing humanitarian band-aid in short term or securing financial concessions at international fora, which may benefit the ruling elite in the name of victims of climate change, and therefore may end up further entrenching inequalities in health and life. Thank you very much for your patience.
Thank you, Dr. Murray. That's okay. I'll make everybody else think quickly with their questions. We have 5 minutes, so maybe we can take 2 questions or so, and then you can answer them quickly. Thumbs up. Anybody have burning questions? Yes, please introduce yourself and tell us your question.
I was just wondering that how the system of canals that has been very successful over more than a period of century, 100 and 120 years of the colonial era, has immediately got irrelevant or inappropriate in this climate debate that you were discussing. How was it possible?
Before you answer, maybe we can get one more, just to make sure. Okay, is there another question that we can throw out for Dr. Fraser?
Somewhat related question. I was curious about whether there was something about population growth in relation to this infrastructure and density of populations compared to the previously relatively capable infrastructure that compounded, maybe there was something
Okay, so yeah, we're staying in this room after that as well, so hopefully I'll have a chance to interact with other people. So yeah, in response to your questions, it depends on how we look at success, what kind of narrative we buy into. These canals were marvelous, the canal system, the railway networks and all that, and they were very productive and all that. You know that narrative that was in effect. But productive for who? They are mainly for colonial extraction. That's what they were there for, to expand into these uncharted lands and make them irrigatable and get production, and then put the railways to take that production away. So that model or that system or that political economic arrangement has continued after colonization. And it is not necessarily the people who lived in those communities earlier or who were then maybe brought to the new settlements along the canal system. It's not necessarily them that have benefited from this highly productive infrastructure. It is the colonial governments and the post-colonial elite that has benefited. If you look at the communities that were most affected during these floods, they are already poor communities, despite these mega projects and canals. So I think I would challenge the successful narrative around these irrigation systems and canals and railways. The second thing is that for the last 70 or 60 years, we didn't have that pattern of flooding, that magnitude. So hill torrents from the western Coastal ranges. So eastwards flow of the hill torrents. We haven't seen that. The pattern of flooding we are used to is different. Now with climate change, we have these unpredictable patterns. So what seems to be a nice working, successful canal system suddenly becomes a problem rather than something that we take time. We can keep talking about that later on as well. And I think in terms in response to Sarah's question, yes, it's the local communities, sport communities, especially in the most affected areas of Balochistan and Sindh. These are people who had been there already before the building of these canals. Yeah.
Okay, perfect timing. That brings us to 1:30. If you can all join me in thanking Dr. Karak. People have more questions, maybe they can tell us.
I wish we had more time for that.
I'll wait for someone.
Yeah, it's not just me, we all over two things.
No, it's straight. We learned a lot.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.